once for yes.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes. Well, Halloween seems a long time ago now. Leftover pumpkins are gently rotting on compost heaps. We're waking to misty mornings with sparkling, frost-covered rooftops. And the first strings of bright fairy lights are appearing in windows as we barrel towards the festive season. But before you start in earnest on the mince pies and mulled wine, maybe take a breather from the inevitable holiday shopping to sit with us a while as we enjoy one of the best parts of winter, sharing ghost stories. So Fitz, what have we got coming up on today's episode?
Coming up, we've got some of our favourite tenous-link Halloween news stories on the Paranormal Radar. We have listener stories from Harriett, Tony and Selena, and an update from Caroline about the ghost chicken. We'll be chatting to our very special guest, Folklorist Icy Sedgwick, about folklore and the paranormal. And we round out the show with some of your recollections of Ghostwatch. We were thrilled that so many of you got in touch to share these with us following the release of our special Ghostwatch bonus episode on Halloween. But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to say welcome and a huge thank you to our latest patrons.
Nicholas Greenaway,
Joanne Bingham,
Kim S,
Siobhan Whitaker,
and Jennifer Patrick.
And we'd also like to say thank you to Afzal Khan for making a donation through KOFY.
Thank you so much to all of our patrons, Repod and KOFY supporters, old and new. We're so grateful that with your support, we're able to continue making this show, and we're so happy to have you along for the ride with us on this weird and wonderful journey into the paranormal.
Now, I think Lil's got our first Paranormal Radar story this episode, so Lil, what's Ping the Paranormal Radar?
Well, as you all know, we watch with delight every Halloween as news outlets scramble to hop on the spooky season bandwagon and try and find something ghost-related to write about, however tangential that may be. But we did comment in our last episode that not many seem to have bothered this year. Well, a few did, but they all left it rather to the last minute, so we didn't have time to catch them for our Halloween episode. But better late than never, we can share them with you now. And the prize for my favourite this year goes to Cornwall Live. It's not the most tenuous link we've come across, but it features a gloriously mundane ghost story, and you guys all know how much I love a mundane ghost story. The article rather dramatically claims that people are more likely to see a ghost or supernatural apparition in Cornwall than almost anywhere else in England, according to a list collated by PsychicWorld.com. Pretty impressive. Although the article swiftly goes on to reveal that in fact, Cornwall wasn't actually that near to the top of the list of most haunted places in the UK, with the Isle of Wight, Wiltshire, Herefordshire and Somerset pushing it down into a slightly more lowly fifth position. Of course, Cornwall does have some incredible locations and ghost stories that, in fairness, they do mention in the article, such as Bodmin Jail, the Monk of Pengusick Castle, and the White Lady of Godolphin. But what I loved was that Cornwall Live decided to make the main focus of their feature George the Ghost, who tried to make off with a 4-pack of Stella Artois lager from the Penzance Co-op. Haunting's a thirsty work, don't you know? A store assistant told Cornwall Live that the shop had always had a spooky reputation, and that it was quite common to find paperwork had been moved around by the resident spirit. But nevertheless, staff were shocked when George's activities were caught on camera for the first time, after the CCTV showed a 4-pack of Stella inexplicably flying off the shelf and into the aisle, whilst all staff were accounted for in the cash room. Now, I love a really scary story and romantic tales of unfinished business just as much as the next person, but the stories that really make me smile are accounts of ghosts just trying to go about their mundane, everyday business, albeit on the other side of the veil, and this one delivers. George, I hope you eventually got to enjoy your 4-pack of Stella. Another interesting tidbit they reported in the article was that the most commonly reported apparitions in the country are apparently phantom horsemen. It's certainly true that we came across a lot of historical accounts of them when researching our Phantom Coaches episode, but I was surprised to see that they are still so widely seen, so that was pretty interesting.
Our second story takes us to Scotland, where the Daily Record reported on the release of a Freedom of Information request to Police Scotland, asking for details on any calls to the police involving paranormal activity from January 2019 until the request, which was made in March of this year. There were a handful of reports that we wish we could find out more about, such as the black creatures coming out of a wall at a home in Glasgow, the paranormal attack in Lanark, and the ghost child seen in the Highlands. Sadly, though, of the 40 incidents, the majority seem to be either hoax calls or, possibly worse, people breaking COVID lockdown rules to go on investigations, people breaking into locations believed to be paranormal, and even disturbing graves. I think we're going to need to make a black book style list of don'ts. Don't break into locations you don't have permission to enter. If you can't get permission, go somewhere else that you can get permission to go. Don't take things from historical monuments. And I can't believe that I even need to say this one. Don't disturb people's graves. None of that.
Or any of the other. And if you haven't seen the Black Books TV series with Dylan Moran and Bill Bailey, oh, please do go and watch it. It's just one of our favourite things in the whole wide world. Well, for our third story, I did find an article that was a little less tenuous and rather piqued my interest in a BBC News article posted on the 31st of October. Their piece was about haunted castles in Wales, but the one I want to talk to you about today, and I'll apologise in advance to any Welsh listeners, I'm going to try my best, I promise, with the pronunciation, is Craigennos, a neo-Gothic castle in the Brecon Beacons National Park that was once home to the world-famous opera singer Adelina Patti. To get the lowdown, the BBC spoke to Mark Rees, author of the book Paranormal Wales and host of the podcast Ghosts and Folklore of Wales, as he'd been on a couple of investigations at the castle. And one of his experiences really got my interest because it involved a scrying mirror. We've talked about the use of scrying mirrors in paranormal investigations on this show before, and even conducted our own experiments and research into the origins of the psychomantium, a kind of scrying that was developed from an ancient Greek method by Dr. Raymond Moody in the early 1990s, and which has gained popularity in paranormal circles in recent years. But the problem with any kind of mirror scrying is that we know, scientifically, that if you stare at your own face in a mirror for long enough, especially in a darkened environment, you start to see weird things. Our eyes and brains are trained to try and make recognisable shapes out of things, and left without sufficient stimulus, they'll start to, essentially, invent stuff. So, whilst Moody's research with the psychomantium was compelling, can we ever be sure that what we're seeing isn't just pareidolia? Well, what about if two other people saw the same thing in the mirror as the person scrying did? Because that's exactly what happened to Mark Rees during a group investigation at the castle. As one lady of the group sat looking into a scrying mirror, Mark and another man stood behind her. Peering into the mirror, the lady saw her face start to morph and change. As previously mentioned, this is quite a common experience while scrying. The thing that was very odd, though, was that from where Mark and his companion were standing, they could see the lady's reflection in the mirror, and they could see the reflected image morph and change as well. The two men remarked out loud that the reflection in the mirror now looked as though it had a beard. Upon hearing this, the lady at the mirror jumped up in apparent shock that they could see the same thing she could, and understandably, a few choice words passed her lips. She obviously regained her nerve, though, and sat back down at the mirror once more, but the strange reflection had vanished. To add a little more intrigue to the story, Mark went on to tell the BBC that he visited again 5 years later, setting up a camera in the same place the scrying incident had occurred, presumably in the hopes of capturing a repeat performance. But it seems that whoever had appeared that night had other ideas, because while standing on the very spot the incident had occurred, as he tried to relate the tale to his companion, he was interrupted by a bulb in his filming light exploding. It's certainly interesting that Mark's experiences happened in the theatre, which seems to be one of the paranormal hotspots of the castle. Built between 1841 and 1843 by Captain Rhys Davies Powell, Craiginos had an air of mystery and intrigue about it even in the early days. There were rumours that Powell's family were under the thrall of a curse. Rumours that were only reinforced by several tragedies in the family. Powell sadly lost his younger son, daughter, and his wife in quick succession before passing away himself in 1862. The curse appeared to continue haunting the family when the untimely deaths of Powell's eldest son and his son-in-law meant that the castle remained in the family for only 32 years. There seems to have been less drama with the next owners, but it was with the third owners that Craiginos really became famous, when it was purchased in 1878 by Adelina Patti, a name which may not be familiar to us now, but in the 19th century she was the pop superstar of her time. At the height of her career as she conducted tours all around the globe, she was earning up to £1,000 for each appearance. That might not sound so outrageous now, but to put it in perspective, when she purchased Craiginos and its surrounding parkland estate, it cost her £3,500. Imagine if you pocketed enough to buy a Welsh castle every third paycheck. Over the years that she lived there, she expanded the castle, adding north and south wings, a clock tower, conservatory, winter garden, and the theatre, where she would put on performances for select audiences. Adelina lived at the castle for the rest of her life. She performed there, made gramophone recordings of her voice there, and by all accounts loved the place very much. So it's no surprise that her spirit is still seen around the castle. Witnesses have often reported seeing a small female figure wearing black in various rooms around the castle, as well as being spotted gliding across the courtyard. But it seems that her favourite place to appear is of course her beloved theatre, from which witnesses have also heard the unexplained strains of singing and piano music. Sometimes singing and other unexplained sounds have been heard emanating from her boudoir, although unexpectedly it's not her apparition that's been seen there, but that of a well-dressed Victorian gentleman. In life, she was well known for being kind-hearted. She looked after her staff well and was generous to local causes and charities. But she was also known for her fiery temperament and was nicknamed the Diva, an attitude which does not seem to have mellowed at all in death, according to reports from castle guests who have experienced objects being inexplicably thrown and smashed whilst discussing the less favourable points of her career or whilst playing recordings of her songs that she disliked. When the author of the paranormal blog Amy's Crypt visited Craiginos, she discovered that an urban legend has developed, claiming that it's possible to summon the ghost of Adelina Patti by singing or performing in the theatre the song Home Sweet Home, a song that Adelina had become well known for performing during her career. In the 1920s, the castle was sold to the Welsh Memorial Trust and was put to use as a tuberculosis hospital and sanatorium, mainly for children. It seems that patients also encountered Adelina's spirit during their time there, although these witnesses more often described seeing an apparition in white, rather than wearing black as in many other reports. She appeared frequently enough to become known as the Lady in White, and was often seen in the theatre walking up the steps to the stage, or, rather more eerily, would sometimes appear standing at the foot of patients' beds. The castle remained in use as a tuberculosis hospital until the late 1950s, and it's possible that the spirits of some of these patients may have joined the resident ghosts of Craigonos, with reports of shadowy figures roaming the hallways and the unexplained noises of shuffling footsteps and children's laughter joining the catalogue of unexplained activity. It certainly sounds like somewhere we need to visit, and we might actually be able to, one day. The house isn't generally open for public tours, but it is a hotel, and the castle accommodates overnight paranormal investigations with B&B accommodation, which is very convenient. Ghost hunt in the evening, fry up for breakfast. Lovely.
Oh, now I fancy a fry-up.
So, well, I always have fancy a fry-up, but certainly you've only got to mention one and I fancy one.
Well, I hope we do one day manage to get there to go ghost hunting and have a fry-up. I can't think of anything better.
Me too. I really do hope we get to visit one day. Or just to round off the tenuous-link Halloween stories, I just have to add that I found it quite funny that both of those last two news articles featured exactly the same Getty Images picture under the headline, so I guess that was just the first thing that came up in the images search. But I just loved the Getty description that the Daily Record actually kept in, because it was a supernatural concept of a ghostly woman wearing a long white dress walking through a spooky, foggy forest in winter with a grunge vintage edit, because it sounds like my entire aesthetic summed up quite neatly right there.
Almost, except I can't imagine you wearing a long white dress.
No,
it would
that's
have
true.
to be a long black dress.
That's very true. Fair enough.
Well, it's time now to begin the listener stories for the episode, and we begin with an update on a story, or at least an update on something that was oh so casually mentioned in a story, but really, really needed following up on. Back in episode 60, where we interviewed Paul Stevenson from Haunted Magazine, we had a story from Caroline about living in a haunted Tudor farmhouse in Wales. However, she started her story by saying, "I've had a few encounters with not-so-usual things. A creepy choir singing from an empty and dark church in Heslington, a ghost chicken in Maryland, USA, and experiences of entering places that felt very unwelcoming indeed." Now, I don't know about you, but when someone just casually drops that they've seen a ghost chicken, I've got to know more. Fortunately for us and you, Caroline very kindly got back in touch to share the story of the ghost chicken of Maryland. I didn't elaborate on this story in my original email, as I was quite young when it happened, about 4 or 5 years old, so I don't give it a lot of credit. But anyway, until I was 12, I lived in a town in Maryland called Tacoma Park that was originally founded in 1883 as a Victorian commuter suburb serving Washington, D.C. From 1989 to 1999, the town was roamed by a rooster named Roscoe until he was hit by a car and killed in 1999. According to the internet, no one quite knew where Roscoe came from, but he became something of a local celebrity, and after he died, he remained so beloved that the town erected a statue of him on the high street. We actually moved to Tacoma Park in 1999, when I was 2 years old. I have no idea if we ever sighted the rooster himself, but the statue of Roscoe is something I remember well. In Tacoma Park, I attended a small nursery in the town where all the families were close, and one evening in 2001 or 2002, we attended a cookie party at a classmate's house. When the party was in full swing, I ran into a group of boys who had gone outdoors to play, supervised by one of the dads. "We've gone ghost hunting," they announced. "We even found a ghost camp. Come look." I can't remember the conversation that followed, but I remember that I did end up going back outside with them to look for the ghost camp and to try to capture the ghost itself. We found nothing, and soon gave up our real ghost hunt for a game where we would run out onto the host's wooden deck and peer into their back garden until one of us shrieked gleefully and we'd run back inside away from the ghost. We repeated this a few times, and I ran back inside with everybody else the first few times, thrilled at the idea of escaping from a real, actual ghost. On the third or fourth round of this game, I stayed outside. I remember peering over the railing and seeing something white and hunched, and, if my memory's to be trusted, glowing. It moved in a strange way, and for years afterwards, I would picture it as a very small, hunched man. It wasn't until years later, living in Wales and surrounded by pheasants, that I realised the strange jaunt I had seen was reminiscent of the jerky movements made by pheasants and roosters alike. Likewise, the size the man I'd seen was about right to actually be a rooster. Even his strange hunched shape, almost cartoonish, was far more like a chicken's than a man's. So I figured that what I spotted that evening wasn't a strange small man with cartoonish features, but was actually Roscoe the rooster, patrolling the town he'd loved so much. And if you want to hear a little bit more about Roscoe the rooster, she kindly included a link to an article about him which we will put on the show notes on the website.
Oh, thank you, Caroline. I love that so much. I'm so glad that we finally heard the story of the ghost chicken, and I love it. Because, do you know what? I've always said, right, I love the stories about animal ghosts. And obviously a lot of them are ghosts of cats and dogs and maybe horses even, beloved pets, basically. And that makes sense because, you notice them around the house. You're in more of a position to see those ghosts, perhaps. But I've always wanted to know, what about the ghosts of cows and sheep and, and roosters and chickens? I just love the fact that there may just be a ghost rooster.
Well, yes, awesome. I'd love the idea of the ghost rooster, but, just think, you're driving down the road, you see a field of cows. Who's to say that one of them isn't a ghost cow?
That's very true. We've seen other ghosts of people that look like completely real, solid human beings. Who's to say it's not any different with animals?
Got another question for you, though.
I think I have the same question.
What on earth is a cookie party?
And can we go to one?
Well, you can go if they make you special cookies. I can't have cookies at all.
No.
If it involves cookies, because I don't know what a cookie party. I presume it involves cookies.
Yeah. So I would need a gluten and dairy-free cookie party, but nevertheless, it sounds amazing. And it's definitely not something we have over here, so I'm now fascinated to know what a cookie party is. Please do tell us. I'm sorry, Caroline, every time you get in touch, we just come back to you with more questions.
So thank you, Caroline, for updating us on that story. I can now sleep at night once more. And now, settle in, dear listeners, for a chilling story from the frosty winter lanes of a little village near historic Canterbury. And this one is from Harriett.
I'm happy to admit, right at the start, that I may be the least psychic person in the UK. I've slept quite soundly and happily in some allegedly haunted rooms, nothing seen, nothing heard, nothing experienced. Except this odd little incident that happened when I was living in Kent. In 1986, I was at college in Canterbury. Now, any city that can boast a 900-odd-year-old cathedral, the site of a brutal murder of an archbishop, and a town full of wild and sinister stories, lonely corners, and strange lore, has a certain esoteric charm, not to mention a spooky reputation to uphold. But it wasn't in those particular dark lanes that I had my only encounter with what I think of as a possible ghost. It was in a tiny, sleepy village called Westbere. At this time, I was living with two friends as the house guest of an elderly man who would let students stay with him completely rent-free for a term or two, just for a bit of company. The only downside was that his bungalow was about 6 miles outside the city walls. Not too much of a problem, though, when balanced against all that rent money to be saved. To get to and from college, I could hitch a lift or jump on a bus. I could even, if I'd drunk enough at the student bar to insulate myself from the cold, or was feeling particularly energetic, walk all the way home. And sometimes did, although this meant a long trudge followed by speed walking alone down an unlit road past the village church and graveyard. Our sort of landlord, John, with his monocle and +4s, was quite a character. Despite advancing age, he was amazingly active. Most days, he would call for a taxi to take him into Canterbury to spend the afternoon at the Shakespeare Arms in Butchery Lane. It was only later that we found out the reason he had to go so far afield for his regular pint. At the age of 84, he'd been banned for life from the village pub for raucous behaviour. Having lived in the area all his life, John was full of hair-raising local stories, like the time he claimed to have run into the Headless Horseman of Margate, or what it was like to have been in Canterbury during the brutal Baedeker bombing raid of 1942, when he witnessed the high street strafed with machine gun fire by the Luftwaffe. In fact, John, who rarely stopped talking to draw breath, was a real fount of all local knowledge, and it was incredibly kind of him to open his home to us. There was just one thing, and one thing alone, that John forbade us to do. Unless it was a case of the most dire emergency, we were not allowed to use his telephone. But as there was a red phone box just down the road, this wasn't really a problem. Even in those long ago pre-mobile phone days, I tried to make sure of calling my parents once a week. So, every Sunday night, armed with plenty of loose change, I would dawdle up the road to use the telephone box. One end of Walnut Tree Lane led to the village, the other terminated in a pretty white cottage by the side of the railway line that ran behind our house, and if you were brave or foolhardy enough to take a shortcut and pick your way across the train tracks, you would find yourself in a nature reserve made after the closure of some gravel pits. At the time of my story, it was midwinter, the sort of frosty night where you really didn't want to brave the elements unless you had to. I had dutifully made my phone call and was heading back to the warmth of the bungalow. The street lamps had just come on and were glowing gold. I was feeling quite relaxed. I remember looking forward to getting back indoors and making myself a hot drink. There was a figure coming towards me, heels clicking on the tarmac. Being a no-through road meant that the lane was usually deserted after dark. I looked to see who else was out on such a raw night, expecting to see a dog walker or one of our neighbours. Coming up the lane was a woman I didn't recognise. She was warmly buttoned up in a brown winter coat. Like me, she was wearing glasses, and she also wore a sort of turban affair wrapped around her dark hair. She looked perfectly normal, but as soon as I set eyes on her, I could almost feel my flesh shrinking in almost overwhelming repulsion. I couldn't bear the thought of her passing close to me. I've never felt so strongly repelled by anyone or anything before or since that night. I felt that I could not bear to go near her. Pure instinct took over, and without even thinking, I haired up the road towards the woman, turning off and running down our driveway just before we crossed paths. I flung myself so hard in through the unlocked kitchen door that the next day I found bruises on my arm. Heart in my mouth, I listened. The woman's footsteps continued past the house and disappeared up the lane. Now I was safely inside. Any fear had completely evaporated, leaving me feeling really foolish. I must have looked a complete idiot. Too embarrassed to tell anyone what had happened, I more or less forgot about the incident, and my Sunday night trips to the telephone box continued as before. The term ended. Eventually, spring arrived, and with the coming of lighter evenings, I even grew blasé about strolling home alone past the graveyard. One day, after we'd taken a long walk around the nature reserve, we returned home to find John gearing up to tell some of his stories. He filled his pipe and took a few puffs. We settled down with a cup of tea and waited patiently to hear what fantastical bit of old nonsense he was going to come up with this time. A lot of time has passed and John is long gone, but to the best of my remembrance, this is the gist of what he told us that evening. In the early days of World War II, John and his family were living in a house a little further towards the centre of the village. He and his missus had 2 young daughters, and these girls were fast friends with the children of the couple who lived in the white railwoman's cottage at the end of the lane. One day, this boy and girl came home from school to find that there was nobody home to let them in. No sign of life, no smoke coming out of the chimney. Not knowing what to do, they circled the house, tapping at the windows, before eventually walking down to the Yew Tree Inn to ask for help. The publican fetched the bobby, and together with a few stout lads, they accompanied the children back to their home and managed to break the front door down. A grisly sight confronted them in the kitchen. The railway worker had killed his wife, then cut his own throat. It was rumoured that the family had grave financial problems, and it was supposed that these had led the man to commit this terrible act. John paused dramatically. Taking his time, he tamped down his tobacco and relit his pipe. He certainly knew how to keep his audience in a state of anticipation. Then, he continued, "Did we know that the murdered woman was supposed to haunt the lane outside? He hadn't actually seen her himself, but knew plenty of villagers who claimed that they had." Then he added in a rather gleeful little bit of character assassination. Although the neighbours had liked the man, the locals had never really warmed to his wife. For a start, she was from London, and, as if this wasn't damning enough, it was also generally agreed that she gave herself airs and graces. For example, many of the villagers disapproved behind her back of what they considered as her inappropriately modish way of dressing. Even though she made her clothes herself, they were always cut in the very height of fashion. However, it was the unruly village children who used to be the real bane of her life, frequently running after her in the street, shouting, "Mrs. Puddinghead," because of the highly fashionable turban that she insisted on wearing, even out in the middle of the English countryside.
And thank you to Harriett for sharing that story. I must admit, when I got that in and I started reading it, I kind of had this trope in my head that it was going to be John that was the ghost.
Oh yeah, do you know what? I didn't even think of that.
I was literally, my brain was just like, she's going to go to the pub, and because he's banned, she's not going to expect to see him there, but someone's going to go,
yeah.
"Oh, you know, you're new to town, where are you living?" "Oh, I'm living at John's." "Oh, you bought the place then?" It's like, "No, John's still there." "No, John died 5 years ago." I was waiting for that.
Oh, I love the way your brain works. Mine didn't go there at all.
And I just completely wasn't expecting the twist.
So it was more of a surprise then.
Oh, yeah. Like, I thought I'd got it sussed. And then it's like, no.
Even better. Oh, I love that story so much. And I wish I could have spoken to John. He sounds amazing. I love when people have these incredible stories, and he sounds like such a great storyteller as well, like pausing and tamping down his pipe, ready to kind of just build up to the big climax. He sounds like such a character.
Indeed. And what was the deal with the phone as well? It's like, he's got one secret rule. It's like, you're not allowed in the back room. You're not allowed to use the phone.
Don't use the phone. Probably just because it was expensive back then, maybe?
I'm wondering if he was like secretly a doctor, and it was like the... as in Doctor Who doctor.
Right.
So I'm going along the police phone box.
Yeah.
But it was actually a TARDIS. And if you picked up the phone, the house would travel in time and space.
I suspect it may have been a more practical thing that, young people like to chat on the phone. They're quite well known, especially in the 80s. It was a bit of a trope again. Teenage young people chatting on the phone for hours now.
Oh yeah,
and
I remember when I was a
calls.
kid and living on the phone for hours at a time. Yes,
and
I know.
They were expensive, and but I prefer your explanation.
Yeah, I still prefer the TARDIS.
He could well have been Doctor Who. We don't know.
It goes with the tales.
It does. Well, the other thing that really interested me about that story was this feeling of repulsion.
I was going to mention that, just simply because I think you've had that before.
Yes.
I was going to say, like, I wonder if it's just the weird, the strange, the other that makes us have that feeling. But I think that's more just a kind of fear, like being afraid of something, whereas we go out and look for spooky stuff all the time. It's what we do. And yet you've had that experience when we went to Haunted Antiques, wasn't it?
Yeah, like you say, I mean, we still, even now, even though we go out and look for it, we still get that little frisson of, something other, that little fear, that little kind of...
on the back of your arms go up.
Goosebump. Yeah, exactly. We still get that when we kind of become aware that we might be in the presence of something, as you put, other. However, that feeling of repulsion I have only ever experienced once in all these years of running after the strange and spooky. And yeah, quite rightly, you said, it was at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Leicester when we went up there to interview Neil. Now, we'd been given a guided tour around the whole place by a lovely chap, and he'd picked up quite a few objects and held them, because it's a very hands-on place. These things aren't behind glass cages. They encourage you to pick them up and handle them. And there were a few objects that the chap wanted to tell us the story of, so he'd pick them up and kind of present them to us. Not a problem all the way around, bearing in mind this place is packed from floor to ceiling with haunted objects. Until we got to one, I can't remember exactly what was in it. It was like a glass...
like a vial of earth or something from somewhere something weird had happened.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly.
It was, like you said, a glass bottle of something.
Ago now, wasn't it?
It was a long time ago. A glass bottle of earth, I think. But I've never had a reaction like I did to this. The chap picked it up, held it out, as he had done with all of the other items, and I physically ducked. Like he'd just pulled a gun on me or something.
Like a vampire with a cross.
Yes, exactly. It was so weird. I literally felt a visceral repulsion to it, so much so that I just completely instinctively, I ducked out the way, as if he'd gone to strike me or something, which obviously he didn't. I didn't understand it then. I still don't understand it now, but it was as though somebody had tried to throw acid in my face or something. I just couldn't physically stop myself recoiling. So I can only imagine that may be something similar to what you experienced. But I do think there's a very distinctive difference between that and just that kind of general unease at something a bit spooky going on. So I wonder what was causing that, because I think I do know what you mean, or I've had a similar experience before. And we're staying firmly in the 80s for now, with a couple of ghost stories from Tony.
Going back to the 80s, I was a Met police officer working for what was then known as the Diplomatic Protection Group. Now it's called SO6, the Specialist Operations Directorate. It's the largest department of armed police officers in the UK. We were tasked in providing armed protection to VIPs, government buildings and diplomats in the London area. I was working nights on the day in question. It was a hot summer night, and I was posted to the residence of a government minister, whose house was situated not very far from Buckingham Palace. I'll not go into exact details of its location for security reasons. It was about 2 a.m, and I was inside the main house, and decided to take a walk around the perimeter of the building to check on its security. At the time in question, London was on a heightened state of alert, as terrorists were planting bombs and were creating havoc in the capital. The street in question is very atmospheric. It's one of the few areas in London that's still gaslit, and it's regularly used for filming TV and movie costume dramas such as Sherlock Holmes. I opened the heavy front door, and to my surprise, I saw a young boy standing in front of me, just back from the doorstep. He was about 10 to 12 years of age, and very well dressed, in a baker's boy flat cap, a russet brown pullover that buttoned at the shoulder, brown corduroy knickerbocker trousers, long grey woolen socks, and brown boots. He was also holding in his hands a full-size, old-style heavy leather football. My first thought was that there was a film crew nearby and that I may be able to scrounge a coffee from the catering truck. I said to him, "Hello mate, what are you doing here?" He didn't say anything and just smiled at me. He then started to bounce the football, and it was at this point that I realised that as the heavy football struck the tarmac surface at the front of the house, that it made no sound of its impact. I then saw a lady standing about 10 yards behind the boy. She was about 30 years of age and was wearing a style of dress that I can only describe as Edwardian. She wore a long grey dress that had leg of mutton sleeves. She wore her long dark hair pinned up, and she wore a straw boater that was decorated with wax fruit. I saw her mouth move, but heard nothing, and she indicated with a hand for the boy to come to her. The boy smiled at me again, waved goodbye, and turned and ran towards the lady. As he reached her, she held out her hand. The boy took it, and then they both vanished. I don't know what happened that night. A time slip? Ghosts? I don't know. I immediately asked my control by radio for a time check, which, on receiving it, and I confirmed with my wristwatch, so I know I wasn't dreaming. For my second story, I was on duty standing near to the Polish embassy in Portland Place, providing security for a function at the embassy. I was approached by an elderly lady. She looked at me and said, "Is your name Roger?" Now, Roger, standing for Roger the Dodger, was a family nickname used mainly by my father. I said, "I'm sorry, but do I know you? Are you family or a family friend?" She looked at me and said, "You're going to think that I'm mad, but I'm a medium. Your dad came to me whilst I was shopping in Oxford Street and asked me to come and speak to the police officer who's standing down by the BBC. He said you can recognise him as he has a beard and is wearing a flat cap." At this point, I ought to say that my dad had died 6 months prior of lung cancer. The lady said, "He's a big man, broad-shouldered, built like a wrestler, looks like Burt Lancaster, got a hook nose." This was a perfect description of my dad. "He's asked me to tell you that he's okay now and out of pain. He's with his mum and dad and his dogs, and that he loves you all. As you might guess, I was dumbstruck and I could not thank her enough. She finally allowed me to pay for a taxi to take her home to East Ham. Makes one think, doesn't it?
So thank you to Tony for sharing those two incredible experiences with us. What struck me about there were so many points I wanted to talk about, but the first one, I have to say, it's basically the experience that I've wanted to have my whole life. When I was a child, growing up, the kind of fiction books that I would read about ghosts, this is exactly the kind of thing that happened, and it's what I always wanted to happen.
I was going to say, it is classic Ghost. It is textbook. It's just, you couldn't have had a better experience of that.
Well, it may not have felt like that at the time, obviously. But
well,
looking
it
back
didn't feel threatening.
True.
Obviously, it's like, you're right, mate, what are you doing here? It obviously felt quite natural, not terrifying. And, again, I'd love to have experienced that.
Oh, I wish. I really hope one day that we will experience something like I hold out hope.
Well, I'll tell you what, in a lot of places wear body cams now. Just imagine if he was wearing a body cam and that had happened.
Oh, my goodness. Can you imagine? Amazing.
Awesome.
The thing is, I suppose part of the fear would have been taken away in the first instance. As he said, this is an area that's used for filming, like well known for being used for filming. So, of course, that's what you would think. You wouldn't think anything of it to begin with, would you? You'd just think, they're recording something. There's people in costume. It's only at the point where they disappear that you're like, oh, what happened there? So, was it a time slip? Was it a ghost?
I think probably ghost. I think if it was time slip, he'd have been able to hear them talking.
Really? Okay, that's an interesting point. Well, my thinking...
I know we've heard that time slips can be a little bit muffled, but...
Yeah, well, I was going to say that's where my brain was going, because we have heard before that you get this kind of muted sound, almost like you're in a weird kind of bubble. So that bit didn't surprise me. I think my brain was going more to the fact that, well, they didn't exactly interact, did they? But usually with a time slip, it's become very obvious to the witness that the people they're watching that seem out of place or out of time have no idea that the witness is even there. Like, there's no recognition of that witness. They're kind of outside of that, whatever's being replayed.
I know, a lot of the times the time slips, they'll go into a shop and buy something.
Yeah, true.
They'll interact.
Yeah, true. No, that's fair.
Like, I was thinking at first it was more like a sort of stone tape thing and it just hadn't recorded the audio, but the boy looked at him.
Yeah. Yeah, so you do have that interaction. Oh, this is a head scratcher. Oh, I don't know, but I love it. And the second one?
Yeah, I'm not convinced on mediums. I don't know where I land on mediums.
No,
but
it's a difficult thing, isn't it?
When some random person approaches you in the middle of London and
For
goes,
no good reason.
"Are you so and so?" It's not like somebody you might have seen around the village a few times. I can't imagine, having been to London, I can't imagine. Well, I was about to say I can't imagine bumping into somebody you know, but I went to London once and bumped into somebody I knew. So. It was the strangest thing. I was literally just walking, like, in a really busy street. It was like Oxford Street or something, and I literally bumped into a friend of mine.
Oh, wow.
Had no idea. Hadn't seen him in weeks. A friend, but not a close friend, and just like, huh?
What are the chances of that's weird? But no, like you say, in this context, this woman had nothing to gain. Nothing to gain, from this encounter at all. And she had a lot to lose, actually, because if you, as she quite rightly said, if you rock up to somebody and go, well, I've got this weird thing to tell you, they're probably going to think you're a little bit bonkers. So she actually had a lot to lose, but, obviously felt that it was really important enough to take that risk, which was lovely of her.
Yeah, definitely. Strange. I'm a little notch closer to
being sold
on mediums now. Oh, amazing. Both stories, fantastic. And you mentioned that you have another on-duty story if we're interested. And of course
we are, Tony. Please do send it in. We would love to hear it. Thank you.
And it's time now for our last listener story of the episode. And this one is from Selena.
It all started around the time my grandfather passed away, almost 10 years ago now. He'd gone into hospital for a routine procedure, but unfortunately never came home. He'd ended up in a coma in hospital, and as his condition started to deteriorate, the hospital rang the family to inform them that he didn't have long. So his closest relatives, including my mum, all gathered around his bedside in his last hours. The entire family there were understandably distraught, my mother most of all. At one point, she excused herself to take a breather on her own. She found a visitor's breakout room located at the end of the corridor. She was relieved to see that it was empty. The time of day probably helped, as this was the middle of the night. As she took a seat and tried to compose herself, all of a sudden she heard a voice, clear as day right by her ear, indisputably her father's voice, in a soothing tone say, "Come on, Helen, don't be upset. We all have to die sometime, and I'm okay." Now, my mum is normally a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal and a pretty rational person. In that moment, however, she just couldn't find a rational explanation. She said that after the initial shock from hearing the voice so clearly, she felt a great sense of calm wash over her, and she realised that her father's words gave her the comfort and strength she needed to carry on. When she went back to his bedside a few minutes later, she was told that he had passed away while she was out of the room. She's never heard his voice again since that day. Shortly after he'd passed, I went to visit my nan. She started recounting a recurring experience she had around that time. My nan lives alone now, and her living room looks out onto a balcony on the second floor with floor-to-ceiling windows. Her sofa sits directly to the right of this large window. She told me that on more than one occasion, she would be sitting on the sofa watching TV, and whilst catching her reflection in that window, she would see the outline of what was unmistakably my grandfather sitting on the same sofa right next to her. She could make out that the figure was very tall. He was 6'6", and she was even able to make out his dark hair and moustache. She said that the figure would only ever last a few seconds after she'd spotted it, and he would never interact with her, despite trying to communicate with it when it appeared. When you look out that window while sitting on the sofa, there's a large pillar on the balcony directly outside, so there's no way this figure could be mistaken for anything else. She's also on the second floor, so it's not like someone from the street could be standing out there and being mistaken for this figure. My nan, at the time, had a sharp mind, decent eyesight for her age, and wasn't prone to telling tall tales. She's a believer in the paranormal, and strongly believes that it was the spirit of my grandfather just checking in on her. The last time it happened was several years ago, so I like to think he's settled on the other side now.
And thank you to Selena for sharing that story. I must admit, I wish all our relatives had the opportunity to be able to do that.
Just pop in and just check in, go, say I'm all right.
Yeah, I'm fine, I'm good, don't worry, don't panic. Just the amount of healing that could be spread if we could all have that.
Yeah, it's just it's such a wonderful opportunity to just get that little bit of comfort. I love these stories. I absolutely love them. And like you say, if there's nothing else, well, not only that there was nothing else there that could be mistaken for a figure, I mean, your nan is going to know the reflection of her husband, intimately, that when you know somebody that well and you've lived with them and you love them, you would recognise that reflection in an instant. You know, there's no way you could mistake that as far as I'm concerned.
Like I can recognize your footsteps.
Yep.
Like just the things that nobody else would be able to tell.
Yep.
Like I would be able to know it was you.
Unmistakably. Thank you again so much to Selena for that story. I love these heartwarmers. Thank you.
And that is the end of the listener stories for this episode. Thank you so much to everyone that shared their stories with us. They are the heart and soul of this show. And if you have a story that you'd like to share, please do get in touch through our website over at knockOncevs.com. But fear not, the show's not over yet. In fact, you may want to pop and get a fresh cup of tea, maybe even a biscuit, and settle in as we take a deep dive into the realms of folklore and the paranormal with Icy Sedgwick.
We've got a very special guest with us today, as we want to explore something a little bit different in this episode. We want to discuss the places that the paranormal and folklore collide. Now, growing up as a paranormal enthusiast, many of the books I read wove local folklore, myth, legend, and ghost stories together seamlessly. But I feel a bit like this fell out of popularity in more recent years when modern ghost hunting TV shows started to pop up and tales were pushed aside by technology and stories were shunned in favour of the pursuit of collecting the ever-evasive evidence. In fact, it's one of the reasons we started this show, because we felt that people's own personal stories were being discounted by shows trying to appear a bit more scientific, and we wanted to make a space where those stories were put back in their rightful place, at the heart of any haunting. But what of the folklore, the myth and legend? The older research books we buy often boast titles like Legends and Ghosts of the Fens or Ghost Stories, Myths and Monsters of the Peaks. But the more recently published books tend to be more focused on only ghost stories and are marketed as such, with titles like Paranormal Oxford or Haunted Essex. Of course, the folklore can still be found, but has it suffered a disconnect from the paranormal world and community? And is it time now to bridge the gap between the two worlds? Well, we had a good idea of the best person to ask. Writer of the fabulous Folklore blog and podcast, author of dark fantasy and gothic horror novels, PhD student of one of the coolest areas of study I've ever heard of, Icy Sedgwick. Icy, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And I believe you may have been known to do the odd paranormal investigation as well.
Indeed, I used to back in the day. It's actually scary to think it was about 11 years ago now. But I kind of feel like if you're open to such experiences, you can kind of have like little mini impromptu investigations when you're least expecting it.
Oh, yes. We may have to ask you a bit more about that later.
Yeah, I think I'm the kind of person where I sort of feel like, you know, it's all well and good to sort of have, you know, all the kit and all the bits and pieces and everything. But sometimes that's when stuff's less likely to happen because you're going looking for it. And when you're not looking for it, that's when it appears.
I completely agree. So can I ask then, because obviously, like a lot of podcasts, one of the very first questions we always want to ask a guest is sort of their origin story, really. So what did first spark that interest? And when you became interested, was it ghosts first or folklore first, or was it like more like us? Were they pretty much inseparable?
It was very much the last one. And I remember the very first booklet I got, and it was a booklet. It was one of those, like, you know, where it's like obviously some sheets of A4 kind of like folded in half and stapled.
Mm-hmm.
And it was more Ghosts and Legends of Northumbria. And later on, I ended up getting the prequel, Ghosts and Legends of Northumbria.
Excellent.
And like, it was one of those kind of things where every time we went to a stately home or a castle in Northumberland, obviously, and there's plenty of them to go to, we ended up sort of collecting these, and I've got a whole series of them, and the price tag on the back's like 95p or something. And I must have been about 8 or 9, something like that. So all of them had like these famous legends of ghosts, obviously, because we've got quite a few ghost stories in Northumberland, alongside things like the Lambton Worm, obviously down in Durham, or the Laidley Worm up at Bamborough. So you kind of had these folkloric legends and so on, just sitting right alongside ghost stories. And in some cases, you've got both in the same story. So it always kind of seemed a little bit sad to me when I look at the books that are available now, because like you said in the intro, there's a whole raft of books with titles right up here, like Paranormal Tyne and Weir. and it almost like sniffs at a lot of the other stuff. And I'm kind of sitting there going, yeah, but there's quite a few of our legends, which like on one hand could be ghosts, but also could be other things as well, like different types of fairies and so on. So I think that's kind of one of my interest areas is, do we need to divide them up into categories, or can we actually look at them as stories instead, rather than having to go, oh, this is this and that's that. So that was essentially where it all came from. So that would have been basically 30 years ago now, and that makes me feel old.
And I think you were basically describing Lil's childhood there as well.
I was going to say, yeah, I feel like you're my long-lost soulmate, Icy. For me, it was Peter Underwood's Ghosts of Cornwall, and I was 7. But very much the same thing. And yeah, the other thing I wanted to pick up about what you just said was actually one of the reasons I started looking more into folklore was when I started looking into Avebury Rings. It's somewhere I visited in the past and I really want to go to again. But I suddenly realised that as well as ghost stories there are UFO sightings, or are they? There are sightings of strange lights. But when you look further back in the historical record, of course, they weren't reported as UFOs. They were reported as fairies or goblins or will-o'-the-wisps. And it just got me to thinking, why are we making this separation? Because I feel like in the past, they wouldn't have been separated. They all would have been part of folklore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the bit that always fascinates me is when you actually look at the history of the ghost story as an entity of its own right. So not something that you would go and investigate. It was just somebody would tell you they'd seen a ghost and you'd go, okay then.
Yeah.
And it would, and you hear these stories where people would suddenly confess to a crime because they'd been haunted by the person that they'd impacted in some way. And again, that would be accepted as like a perfectly decent legal precedent and so on. And you just don't see that in legal dramas now. And I think that's a crying shame. And it does sort of fascinate me how, in a lot of ways, sort of, the idea of there being places that you just didn't go to because maybe there were fairies there, or, you had to behave a certain way in this particular wood because of whatever reason. But then also it was perfectly normal that a local landowner would continue to walk the village after they died or whatever. And all of them kind of coexist alongside one another. So I do find kind of the separation of them a little bit unusual. I think you can sort of pinpoint when that is. And I think a large part of it sort of probably begins with spiritualism in the 19th century, when ghosts become something you can suddenly quantify and contact in a way that I don't think you get with other folkloric creatures. And that's probably for the best, because I wouldn't mess with the good neighbours if I didn't have to. So I sort of, I've read the stories. I'm not daft, but I do think it is unusual the way that there's been this artificial separation of them, and that ghosts are kind of almost seen as the legitimate one. And then if you say you've seen a UFO, you're a crank. And then if you say that you've seen a fairy, people look at you like, are you okay? So it's weird how ghosts are weirdly like the scientific one, and I'm like, really? Like, have you not looked at the stories?
I don't know. In the making strides, am I correct in thinking things like cryptozoology, like Bigfoot, would be classed as folklore as well? And there's people that go out hunting Bigfoot and that sort of thing.
Yeah, again, that's quite an interesting one, because a lot of the stories do have some kind of precedent in folklore, but then it's kind of taken on its own life as well, in the way that if you said that you saw, for example, one of the British big cats, people would either go, did you really? But then people go, well, big cats exist, so I can believe that being a thing.
Yeah.
Whereas if you were to say that you saw Black Shuck while you were driving home one night, people might, again, be a bit concerned about you. So I think again, it's a weird thing how there's this odd deviation, and one of them somehow, like, people can go, yeah, actually, I believe there probably is something in that one, but not in the other. And it's like, really?
Yeah, I think you're right. And that's what you just said about spiritualism. That's really interesting, because it hadn't occurred to me that that's when this separation could have started. But you're right. It's this idea of nowadays you almost feel like you have to have a legitimacy to something. Like you say, you don't want to be seen as a crank and a kook. Well, actually we do, but we don't care. We're a bit different. So people tend to veer towards, oh, well, no, it's not just folklore and myths and legends and goblins and will-o'-the-wisp. Like, oh, I don't believe in any of that. but ghosts feel a bit more legitimate, or spiritualism would have done at the time, because it was a bit more acceptable in society. And equally, the study of cryptids, it could be seen as being a little bit more scientific. But I just feel like that's such a shame. Like we're just missing out on so much. And I wonder as well, obviously, you know, so many people these days talk about how we've fallen out of a relationship with our land. And I wonder whether, do you think like the loss of sort of the way that folklore's been almost dropped in popularity over the last few decades, do you think that contributes somewhat to this kind of loss of connection with our landscape?
I've got a couple of theories on that, and I think you've actually got to go a little bit further back. And I think when you look at the fact that sort of a couple of centuries ago, maybe people would be born, live and then die all in the same place. So people had a much stronger connection with sort of family, land, things like that. And then I think when you then start getting people moving around more, obviously in search of work and so on, I think that then starts to divorce people from the stories that they've grown up with, although that could also explain why you get very similar stories in such different places.
That's true.
Like the Cornish knockers popping up in American folklore. But I think that there's also the fact that there has obviously been this resurgence in about the last 7 or 8 years, I would say, of interest in stuff like this. Because, I mean, it's obviously always been a thing because of the proliferation of these pamphlets like we found when we were younger. So there obviously always has been an interest, but I think it was probably seen slightly more as like a novelty or a curiosity. And it was really interesting because I don't know why I did this, but something prompted us to suddenly ask on Twitter, I think it was last year, like, so what brought you to folklore? And so many people were saying it was because they'd either moved somewhere and they wanted to find a way to connect with this new place they'd moved to. Other people, it was like if they just simply were visiting somewhere, they like to find out about the story. So again, they kind of knew where they were. And I think obviously to thinking of this in like a British Isles sense, because obviously I wouldn't like to speak to what it's like moving to a country where, how do I put it sort of politely, you know, white people weren't there first.
Yeah.
I think obviously in the British Isles, it's a very different setup. And I think there is that sense of, you know, you go somewhere new and you're like, oh, what stories are here? And in some ways, when they are similar, you can go, oh, well, this is very, very similar to stories I've got. And I recognize these from where I'm from. But then you kind of just feel like you're not a stranger in that area because the stories are there. And I think it did surprise me how many people that was a really big driving force for them to try and connect with an area, or also to try and connect with family members. So people were finding out sort of folk tales from elderly relatives or parts of the family they didn't see very often. And this was a really big one that I got from a lot of American followers, that was how they were then learning stories from different cultures and also different places by actually just sitting down and asking people. So it feels like in some ways it's not necessarily so much that we've become divorced from the land, but we've almost become divorced from each other. And I think the folklore kind of helps to provide a bridge between people in a way that very few other things do.
Definitely, yeah, I completely agree. And it just, while I was sort of coming up for the questions for this interview, it made me think about what folklore I grew up with. And what, well, you know, again, paranormal, ghosts, myths, legends, the whole package from my area, from the land that I grew up in. And I feel like I just missed out on that. So that's one of the reasons I feel like this resurgence is really important, that we kind of bring these stories back and search for them and sort of re-record them and get them back into the record. Because where I grew up in Northamptonshire, it's not that the stories aren't there, but they weren't being circulated amongst communities during the time that I was growing up. So I'm only really discovering them now. I grew up with ghost stories, but from places I visited, not from my homeland. So what was it like in your area growing up? Did you grow up with lots of ghost stories and legends and folklore?
I did, but I have to really thank my mother for that, because my mother's really interested in local history and so on. So, for example, if, say, like my brother's older than me, so he would have to go to, say, secondary school, and I would have like a staff training day at primary school. So my mum would take me into town and would like go on little history walks around town and following, like, you know, the history guidebooks where they've got walks laid out. And so I sort of had quite a a thorough grounding in the history of Newcastle, which, bearing in mind, I mean, it was originally a Roman settlement, and I think there was something else there before. So we've got about 2,000 years worth of history that's at least been recorded, and there's quite a lot of murders in that. So it's quite good when you're quite a gory child to hear all these different stories and things. And again, I think you do tend to find a lot of the stories in Newcastle as a city tend to be much more angled towards ghosts. But then obviously when we go to all these different places, because Northumberland is a really cool but quite, I don't want to call it a lonely place, but it is quite a wild and remote part of the country. And obviously, we used to go to these different places, and, you'd go past where there were supposedly sightings of fairies and this, that and the other. And so I grew up with them purely because it was something that my mum had an interest in and that we could kind of share together. I don't think my brother was massively interested, but I mean, I sort of made him be interested. But so I think it's not necessarily something I don't remember being hugely like at the forefront of people's consciousness. I mean, certain stories like the Lambton Worm, like every kid learnt that at school, but it wasn't sort of to the extent that maybe other things like, the Arthurian legends and things, which everyone seems to know, or like Robin Hood and so on, where they're more like the British myths. People seem to have much more of an awareness of. So I think it is a bit of a difficult one to really say whether I grew up with it or not, because I did, but it was because I had a parent who took an interest. And I think if I hadn't, then I don't know whether I would have just simply come to it later in life under my own steam.
Yeah. So what are some of the most interesting bits of legends and ghosts and folklore from your area, or maybe just your favourite that you've come across, even if that was as an adult?
I must admit, one of my absolute favourites is the number of ghost stories we've got actually in Newcastle itself involving Charles I.
Oh, yeah.
Because he was actually held at this, I'll call it a stately home. It's not there now, but this grand house in the centre of town. And he was under house arrest during the Civil War. And he used to go to like the next kind of borough over, as it were, to go and play golf and stuff. And there's a pub in town called the Old George where he was supposed to go and drink, because, I mean, it dates back to like the 15th century or something like that. And I love just there's all these stories where he's trying to have like escape attempts that went wrong and things like this. And he's meant to just haunt all these different places. And I quite like that because it just kind of almost celebrates like continual failure, which like appeals to me on a certain level.
It's a very British thing, isn't it? We love an underdog.
Yeah.
And I think there's obviously my favourite ones in terms of like wider Northumberland. I love the legends we've got of a character called Silky, who in many of the tales, she behaves a lot like a brownie. So if you left your house like messy, she would tidy it. If you left it tidy, she would mess it up. And I'm like, I don't understand why the solution wasn't obvious there. I mean, I'd more than happily have her coming in and tidy up for us.
Yep. Exactly.
But she's a really interesting one because she also does things like she used to appear on lonely stretches of road and almost like hitch a ride with like solo riders and then disappear again. And the rider was like, oh, where did you come from? Where did you go? And obviously the name came from the fact that she used to announce her presence with the rustling of silk. And there's just something about that story that I just think there's something quite like mischievous but not malevolent about her. But then she also appears in some of the stories actually in town, and she sounds more like either a poltergeist or a ghost. So again, this is where I quite like that slippage between, is a character part of the fairy folk, or is that character actually a ghost, or can they be both at the same time? So I think it's those kind of stories that appeal to me perhaps the most, because of the fact that there's a bit more like mystery to them.
I've got to jump at the sort of the similarity between that and the Phantom Hitchhikers.
Yeah, that pricked my ears up as well.
Just like literally, it is almost what, take horse and swap it for car, and you've effectively got a modern Phantom Hitchhiker. Yeah,
the one thing that Silky would do that you don't get in the Hitchhiker stories, and I think this is a great shame, is sometimes if she was feeling particularly devilish, she would bewitch the horse so it would just stop moving and would not go anywhere. And no amount of cajoling would get the horse to move. And you essentially had three options. You could either abandon the horse and come back for it later, B, wait for daybreak, because when the sun came up, the enchantment would break, or if you had any rowan wood with you, you could touch the horse with that and it would break the enchantment as well. I would dearly love to see some person pick up Silky as a hitchhiker and then like the car just refused to move and then they're kind of like, and like the AA can't shift it and so on. You know, I think that would be pretty funny, but that's just the kind of weird sense of humour I've got. But this is the thing, I think, when you then look at the number of folkloric elements that you then have where people would actually carry rowan wood and so on to ward off fairies and so on. And you think, you know, people had this whole range of practices that they used to just do of a normal day in order to ward off these different things or to protect themselves and so on. And you just kind of think, like, I guess we've got sort of antivirus on the computer and burglar alarms and things, but it just doesn't seem somehow as magical in some ways as a lot of these historical practices.
And I love the bit you brought up about poltergeist as well, because that is, again, that's something that never occurred to me. But when you think about folklore stories of brownies and sprites and mischievous impy type spirits that come in and they mess up your house, like you were talking about, or maybe sometimes they tidy things, you hear about them hiding things. But these days, we would blame that on poltergeists. You know, that potentially, is there a crossover there between, you know, what previously would have been thought of as imps and brownies and what we might now think, what we might now blame on poltergeists?
I think there is, and I can't help thinking poltergeists are one of those things where people have sort of forgotten that obviously poltergeist translates as like noisy spirit. Mm-hmm. So that straight away makes you think, well, why is this then being blamed on like the latent psychokinesis of a teenage girl? And that bit never really sat that particularly well with me, because when you look at a lot of the stories involving brownies, it generally wasn't happening in a sense where because there was one in Sunderland at Hilton Castle with the coal ladder Hilton, as he's known, and he was a brownie and they actually got rid of him because they were sick of his antics and they actually left out a cloak and a hood for him, and he's obviously quite happy with this, capers around the kitchen in them and then disappears and they never see him again. And I sort of think there's no mention of any teenage stuff. There's no mention of the activity being centered around a particular person. It's very much in a specific part of the house, which obviously in this case is the kitchens. And it's almost like a class-based thing. And then you sort of move forward to sort of like now, when you get all these poltergeist stories and someone will immediately go, oh, is there a teenage girl in the house? And I think, but that wasn't always the case. Where did that come from? And in a way, I kind of, it doesn't sit well with me on many levels, that particular way of looking at things. And I think it has sort of then forgotten about some of the historical precedents for this kind of behaviour actually having nothing to do with ghosts.
Well, I think there's something that Lil and I have discussed, and we've come across it a few times, in that a lot of these things are somehow affected by the public consciousness. Like, if people all believe that this is what's happening, then that's what tends to happen. Now, whether that's like just reinforcing, you're looking for things that you're looking for and you see them, and you're not looking for things that you're not, so you don't, and it tends to positively reinforce what you expect to see or not. But it does seem like you say, in the case of poltergeist, you're looking for a situation where there's, a teenage girl that's going through puberty, because that tends to be reported.
That's the trope, isn't it?
That's the trope. And so the cases where that doesn't happen don't seem to be quite as popular.
Do we just dismiss them? Yeah, I know what you mean. But talking a little bit about sort of, I want to say creating ghosts, but that's not quite what I mean. Sort of public consciousness almost bringing a ghost into the world. Can we just ask you about a Ouija board story? I know you had a very strange experience with a Ouija board.
Yes.
And it relates to your work as a published author.
Mm-hmm.
Could you share with us that story? Because I just think this is so fascinating.
Right. Well, I'll preface this by saying that I'm one of those people who doesn't view Ouija boards as like a portal to hell or something.
Mm-hmm. Same.
And I can't help feeling like the Christianization of a lot of things hasn't necessarily been particularly productive.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, to be honest with you, there's a fabulous book by Richard Wiseman called Paranormality, and he talks about how actually Ouija boards are essentially the ideomotor effect.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way you could like legitimately see if you had actually contacted someone is if everybody was blindfolded who was actually touching the planchette.
Yeah.
because there is that sense that unconsciously your brain wants to answer a question, and therefore you could be unconsciously spelling things out. All that being said, there's this particular ghost hunt that we're doing at Kielder Castle, which in and of itself is a bit of an odd building anyway. And at one point we were up in the loft, and like there's this room just full of like rusty saw blades, and honestly it's like something out of a horror film. It was really bizarre.
Oh my God.
And one of the other team leaders was like, "Oh, can you throw something?" And I'm like, "I'd rather like, come on, health and safety people." And we were downstairs with the Ouija board, and there was a couple of other people there. I'd never met them before; they'd never met us before. I think they were from outside the area. And they had this quite lengthy conversation with someone on the board who seemed to be related to them in some way. So they were having their bit chat. And me and the other team leader weren't touching the board at any point while this was happening, because we kind of thought, well, these people want to do the ghost hunt, so, they should really be the ones to do it. And I was sort of like sitting there, like waiting for like the next whoever to come through. And sort of said, like, is there anyone there? Yes. Okay, cool. Have you got a message for someone here? Yes. Okay, cool. Who for? And it spelled out my real name, because as you've probably guessed, Icy's not my real name. And they were sitting there like, who is this person? We were like, just go with it. Because obviously I'm sitting there going, that's me. But we were like, I don't want to let on anything, so we'll just go, let's just see what they say. And then so we're sort of like, fair enough then. So who's the message from? And it started to spell out GR. And I was expecting it to be like gran or granddad or something, because unfortunately I lost all my grandparents by the time I was 11. And I was like, is one of them decided they wanted to say hello? Okay, then we'll go with this. But that wasn't what was actually spelled out. It was actually the word grey, which was the first name of a character that I'd come up with. It was like a bounty hunter in the Old West. And the book that he was appearing in hadn't actually even come out yet. So they were kind of like, okay, why is it spelled out a colour? And I was like, again, just go with it. And so I was sort of sitting there like, well, this is really weird. But me being me was like kind of cool though. Mm-hmm. And it takes a lot to frighten me in these kind of incidents. And I was like, this is just weird. So I sort of said, all right, what's your message then? So it spelled out thank you. And I'm like, you're welcome, what for? And then it spelled out life. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? This is really getting a bit bizarre even for me. And I sort of went, my pleasure. And it just kind of then went goodbye, and we were like, cheerio. It was really weird. And like, because the team leader who I was on with, like, he obviously knew about my book and my writing and everything. He was like, that was so weird. And like these poor people were sitting there going, what was all that about? And this is where I thought it was quite interesting, because that would be a really weird set of things for them to spell out, because obviously they didn't know me, they didn't know my book, and it was just a strange set of words to just spell out by accident. So it was kind of a bit like, what on earth?
These are just the most fascinating stories, because like you say, how they couldn't have even subconsciously known to put those things together in one place.
No.
I'm literally speechless. I was just sat here with my jaw dropped. Like, I don't know what to say I don't even know what to ask about this.
It's a strange one as well, because obviously people are like, oh, well, you're not scared. And I'm like, no, I just thought it was strange. But I'm like, it's not the weirdest thing that's ever happened. So I was like, okay. And because that particular character is lovely, I'm like, well, okay, it could have been worse. And then, of course, you start thinking sort of more along the lines of, well, is this actually a character that I've made up? Is it actually some kind of entity that I've inadvertently communicated with? Have I given this character life by simply making up a story for them?
Mm-hmm.
And it then sort of leads to all these weird energetic questions that you think, I can't possibly answer those, so I'm just not even going to try.
But see, those are the rabbit holes I love to go down. And like you, we did a special episode on Ouija boards, actually, because at that time, we've been doing this show 6 years now, and this was quite early on. We'd never used a Ouija board. And so we hadn't really made up our minds what to think about it, because, as you say, they're portrayed in the media ever since The Exorcist, pretty much, as being these awful portals to hell. And we thought, well, there must be more to it than that. So we talked to a lot of different people who've used them extensively and came to the conclusion that it's a tool. Basically, it's no different to using a spirit box, and people don't get freaked out about using a spirit box or a radio or, an EVP device or any of these gadgets. You look like you're going to say something fit.
Yeah, I was going to say, if they really did open portals to hell, I very much doubt there'd be a Barbie version, which I know there is.
There is, in fact, a Barbie version.
I mean, put it this way, they outsold Monopoly in the 60s. So you sort of think,
Nice.
were it not for The Exorcist, people probably wouldn't have the impression of them that they do. And I actually did a talk on spiritualism at one of our venues in town. And I got one of the guys at work, because I work in an art school, so I got one of the guys at work to like make me a Ouija board on the laser cutter, and it's a thing of beauty, it really is. And it's like A2, so it's huge. And I passed it round so that people could say that they touched a Ouija board. And there was this one woman who was just like, no, I don't want to touch it. And I'm like, it's literally a bit of plywood with some letters cut into it with a laser. Like, lasers are cool. And she was like, yeah, no, it's dangerous. And I'm like, well, bearing in mind, I just sent the board round, so it didn't even have the planchette. And I'm like, it's literally just a board with letters on it. But she really, really was so bothered by it that she just didn't. And I'm like, it's currently sitting in my loft. And it has been since late 2019.
Oh, perhaps you need to get it out and give it an airing.
But I'm kind of like, as far as I'm concerned, like, I get that people have had some weird experiences using them, but I can't help thinking that's probably more likely user error. Because anyone who's ever tried to install, for example, a new Windows operating system will find that their computer will start doing weird stuff. A, because it's Windows, but B, if you've sort of done something that the developers didn't foresee, and it's that whole kind of thing, is it a feature or a bug? So I'm like, if something has gone horrifically wrong, A, I'm pretty sure we'll hear about it more regularly, and B, is it more likely that the person's kind of brought something on themselves? And I know that sounds like victim blame, but it's more kind of like, is it like a self-sabotage kind of thing? Or if they have contacted something that they wish they hadn't, was it because they didn't follow the instructions?
I think it can definitely be a self-fulfilling prophecy, as with, and we always say this to people who haven't been on a paranormal investigation before and are planning to go on one, is just to be aware of what mindset you go into that investigation or you go into using a Ouija board with, because if you're going in expecting something awful to happen and be scared, the second anything, a rock skitters across the floor or something, you're going to interpret that in a very, very different way as to how you might if you went in with a mindset of, this is going to be interesting and fun.
Yeah, it keeps compounding itself as well. Like, if something happens that scares you, your heart rate rises, you're more alert, and then something else will scare you more, and it just builds you up and up and up. When, I don't think I've met a single person that's ever really had anything happen that I would think, oh my God, that's awful. Like, why weren't you rushed to hospital immediately? If the people that report, these horrible things happen, it's like, it banged my cupboards. Like, the devil turned up and it banged my cupboards. And it's like, well, if that's the worst he can do, I'm not that worried.
But a lot of times, again, it's just there. You can perceive things in so many different ways, and that applies to anything in life. But especially when it's something you're not expecting and you don't understand, it can quickly become very terrifying.
Oh yeah.
Depending on if you're not used to it, and depending on what factors you've sort of absorbed from like things like paranormal pop culture. I know we sort of blame paranormal pop culture for a lot of things, but, it does kind of have a lot to answer for.
Yeah, they've got a habit now of saying everything is a demon and it's terrifying and it's awful. And, most of the things we've experienced have been very benign, or at least just not one way or the other. Just a thing has happened and it's been weird.
Well, the other thing I wanted to just pick up on from what you said about your Ouija board experience is this idea that, did you create maybe not a ghost, but did you create an entity that was then speaking to you because you brought this character into life, and here it is thanking you for bringing it into life? Because I wonder how many ghost stories this could potentially apply to. Recently, we were digging into the history of the Ferry Boat Inn, where there is a story about a woman that haunts the inn. But when you dig down into the history, this woman never existed, categorically never existed. And we found where the story came from, and it was kind of accidentally made up. It wasn't done to be malicious or anything like that. It was just an accident. So this accidental ghost was sort of put out into the world.
From a Ouija board?
Yes, actually, funnily enough, from a Ouija board. But the thing is, people see her. So where did that ghost come from? Has it been created? Have you come across any stories like that in your research?
There are various sort of in the more magical community. I know when you look at things like the concept of egregores, where it's like a thought form that if enough people believe in it, it kind of takes on form. So there is sort of a precedent for it. And I know the horror film Host, which was on Shudder for a while, plays with this idea in a really interesting way. And because I remember watching that for a conference I was doing, and it's like a seance through Zoom that goes wrong because someone essentially invents this thing. And I have come across a few stories where it's almost like the legend came first and then people start having sightings, and it does make you wonder, are people seeing what they expect to see, or are people actually genuinely seeing something that has then been created because enough people thought it was there? And it is, so I do think it is a possibility, but I also think that sometimes you sort of think, well, why did someone make up the story in the first place? What were they getting at, or were they picking up on something else and it was just misnamed, sort of, or whatever it might be? Or again, are we going down the route of, was this actually a completely different entity that's then been mislabeled as a ghost, and then that's what people are seeing? So it's kind of confusing, and I suppose because we can't very well necessarily like knock on the door of like spirit entities and go, excuse me, we've got a question. I suppose we'll probably never really know.
That's really interesting because, like you say, usually people don't just make a story up from nothing. There's a germ of truth or, a grain of an experience in there somewhere that this is all grown out of. So I was thinking about, is there new folklore being produced today? Could this be a way, or is this a way that folklore does come, like new folklore emerges today?
I think it tends, from what I can see anyway, it tends to be more people engaging with folklore, perhaps in a slightly different way. So when I think of the legend that, I think it's the River Don in Sheffield, there was a belief that it had to have a sacrifice every so often.
Oh, blimey.
And I think two of the members of Pulp used to throw money into the river to try and appease it and things like that. And you sort of think like that's relatively recent. And and I think you do get situations like that where I think people then interact with stuff, and you get this with children's folklore quite a lot as well, where they've got their own set of rules and behaviours, and you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that and so on, that only the children seem to know about, and it doesn't make any sense to adults, but it makes perfect sense to them, and then they just reach a point where they just leave it alone and move on to the next thing, sort of thing. So I think that there is folklore sort of not necessarily being created, but I think it's perhaps being remixed, and I think it's perhaps being built on and just engaged with differently. And I think because as well, the fact that so many of us now have like podcasts or books of are going in search of this stuff, or indeed just simply collecting it, it kind of gives it a new lease of life. So it feels new, but it's perhaps just a new iteration of something that was already there.
Now, that kind of leads into a question that I've wanted to ask you since I heard, and I can't remember who you had an interview with, but you made a distinction between urban legend and folklore. And my understanding is like urban legend is kind of more modern, scary folklore. Like what's the distinction, and can one evolve into the other?
It's a difficult one because in many ways, urban legends have a lot of similarities with folklore. But I think for me personally, the key difference between the two is the method of transmission. So folklore often refers to things that are a bit older. So it's maybe being codified, and some variations may still exist. But in general, for example, if you were to ask someone about, I don't know, some of the legends associated with like the Piper who's supposed to be lost in the tunnel under Edinburgh's Royal Mile.
Oh, and many other places around the UK.
Yeah. There's different versions, but they all ultimately do the same thing. Whereas when you look at urban legends by comparison, because you've got that, like nobody is going to go, oh yeah, I know the fella that went down in a tunnel with a pipe and we lost them, because now you just use GPS. But it's the fact that you'd probably film it, you'd be live streaming it now, so it'll be a very different.
It'll be on TikTok.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be a very different experience. But I think with urban legends, because there's always, it's a friend of a friend, this happened to them. And yes, the person is always like one removed from you, or it's like, your auntie's hairdresser's cousin's mom saw something. So there's like a weird, tenuous human connection, but you don't know the person this apparently happened to, but somebody that you know maybe knows someone they know, kind of thing. And I think that's what then sort of starts to lend urban legends like a degree of legitimacy. But what's really weird about urban legends is the way that they keep being recycled. So there's like the famous one about someone who is at a cash point and drops their wallet, and the person behind them says, "Oh, you've dropped your wallet," and the person then turns around and gives them some kind of warning not to be in a particular place at a particular time, sort of like as a thank you for helping them. And then it turns out that something awful happens at that time and in that place. And that reappears after so many different disasters, and with different types of people being the person passing on the warning. And you start thinking, well, this is clearly an urban legend because of the fact that they're often quite vague. They're only ever told like after the fact. No one ever mentions the stuff before it happens. And because it's, again, somebody who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone, it's never like, I've never had an urban legend where someone said to me, this happened to me. It's always like this tenuous connection with it. And I think that's the slight difference with folklore. Folklore's always kind of either something that you can practice yourself. So, for example, putting a horseshoe over your door, something like that, you can engage with folklore personally, or it's something far removed from you because it's a legend of a thing that happened in this place. And whereas, as I say, urban legends tend to have more of an air of immediacy to them.
And possibly a more sort of cautionary tales, perhaps?
Yeah, very much. So particularly think of the one of like the guy who gets picked up by a woman at a bar while he's waiting for a flight somewhere and then wakes up in a bathtub and he's lost one of his kidneys or something.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, they're a testament to how well humans can encode warnings in stories. And I mean, a lot of the folklore does as well. When you think of Jenny Greenteeth, she's obviously a warning to get people to stay away from water that's full of weeds, because if you fall in, you're probably going to get tangled up in them. So obviously, Jenny Greenteeth is a lot scarier than just saying, don't go in that water because you might get tangled up in the weeds. Yeah. That was the whole thing with those 1970s public information films.
Oh, they were absolutely terrifying.
Exactly.
Robbie on the Railway, was it? Oh, yeah. My, I had nightmares for years.
And the Dark and Lonely Water one.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, the ones with the kites by the power lines.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, man.
But again, it's encoding a warning in a story, and I sort of feel like folklore and urban legends both do that. But urban legends try and have this pretense that, and again, like Phantom Hitchhikers fall under this as well. It's that pretense of it actually happening to somebody, so it could happen to you.
Yeah.
So take something, for example, like Bloody Mary, where it's a thing you can do yourself. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't expect that if I did it myself that anything would happen. Is it the fact that the action that's happening to you makes it an urban legend, like the fact that it's not that you can do it, but how am I best explaining this? Like, I wouldn't say my Uncle Fred did this and she jumped out the mirror and cut his head off. Like, I don't know anyone that's happened to, and anyone that says they do, it's always like you say, a friend of a friend. It's not the act of doing, it's what happens to you when it occurs.
But I feel like Bloody Mary is possibly that mishmash of all three things that we've been looking for.
A sort of crossover.
Yeah, that feels to me like a crossover. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in and answer the question on behalf of Icy. You just sort of sparked my interest there, and that's a ghost story and an urban legend. Is it also a bit of folklore?
Well, I think, again, Bloody Mary's a really interesting one of how you can kind of differentiate between the two, because if you look at, let's see, I'm trying to think of a really good example and I can't off the top of my head because that always happens. But if you think of legends where they explain why something has a particular name, there's a link to a person and potentially a century when it happened. Whereas obviously with urban legends, because they're so vague and the person's name is and whatever happened to them is then, or like with the origin of where it came from rather. So if you look at Bloody Mary, there's umpteen variations of who Mary was and how she ended up really tasked with this quite boring thing to do for the end of time. So it's the fact that because it's the lack of specificity that always makes me kind of go, this is probably an urban legend then. But because there's that lack of specificity, you can then reuse it and adapt it and sort of, it's almost a bit like when you get the royalty-free bits of music that musicians can then sample and do their own thing with. It's a little bit like the story equivalent of that. So you can go, right, well, we're going to create a new version of Bloody Mary, and this one we're going to give her a more up-to-date name, for example, or she's going to do this or she's going to do that or whatever it might be. And I think that's possibly the slight difference with ghost stories, I think, because ghost stories tend to have, from what I've sort of encountered, there tends to be more of a sense of that this was a person that this happened to, even if, again, they're quite vague and you don't have a name or when it happened and so on. But there's still, like, I guess it's plausibility with the ghost stories rather than, so the idea of Charles I haunting a pub where he used to like going for a drink, like people go, yeah, I can kind of see that. The idea of someone jumping out of a mirror and doing whatever to you, people might go, maybe not.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, you mentioned a little while ago movies, and I wanted to ask you, if I can, about your PhD. And I just wanted you to share with the listeners what it is that you're studying, because it's just so cool.
Basically, a really long story short, I'm looking at the representation of haunted houses in contemporary Hollywood. So from 1979 onwards, that's basically the Amityville horror kicks everything off. And the way that I'm doing it is I'm looking at it through the technology of filmmaking. So I'm looking at like, how does sound design have an impact on the way that the ghost appears or the haunting appears? How does cinematography have an impact, and how does set design work? So in some cases, it's like, how does the ghost interact with the set? Or if you look at things like in Poltergeist, and there's that really famous scene where the camera sort of like pans to, I think it's Carol Ann sitting at the dining room table and all the chairs are normal. And then the camera pans to Diane, who's doing whatever in the kitchen, and then goes back to the table and all the chairs are then stacked up in a pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
And it's things like that. That entire ghostly appearance happens off screen because of a pan.
Yeah, very
There's
much
no
riffed
special
on
effect.
by Paranormal Activity that we just watched.
The Paranormal Activity 3, I think, did it that exact thing.
Yeah. I'm not going to comment on the Paranormal Activity films. They have the moments, and I do actually use them in the cinematography chapter, because some of the stuff they do with framing is quite interesting. But I think the problem I've got with like the third one is just the fact that the whole conceit kind of falls apart quite quickly towards the end. But it's just this general idea, though, that how you can then create a haunting on film. And it's the fact that every single one of the films that I'm looking at, and I would argue all of the films that have come out of Hollywood since 1979, all of them have gone with the idea of the ghost is real. So it's not like sort of the more classic ones like The Innocents or The Haunting from the 60s, where it's like, is the main character just losing it, or are they actually having some kind of supernatural experience? With the modern ones, it's like, yeah, no, ghosts are real, this is happening. So the characters might doubt what's going on, but the films themselves just put forward as, yeah, these ghosts just exist, it's just a part of this particular filmic universe. So that's why I'm then looking at how the technology of filmmaking sort of brings them to life.
I just think that's so fascinating. And I love the idea of you're almost kind of studying the haunted house as one of the characters in that film. Because they are, aren't they? You know, the haunted house itself is a major character in any paranormal film. So I'm really interested, with all the films you must have studied for this, and the fact that you've had paranormal experiences of your own and you've done investigations and you know a lot of ghost lore and stories, which films do you think do a really good job of accurately sort of representing more of none of them are going to be realistic because it's Hollywood, but more of a realistic feel of what you've experienced as like actually haunted houses or historic locations that you've been to?
I'd have to be really boring and say none of them.
Fair enough.
Mainly because when I'm looking at the American ones and you're looking at, for example, the original Amityville horror, I love the film in the sense that it's Margot Kidder and James Brolin, so like they're really entertaining in it. But the film itself, because it's trying so hard to be controversial and schlocky and like, oh yeah, this really happened and all that kind of thing, it sort of dispenses with that air of plausibility. But I would probably say, in terms of like which one feels most realistic, it would probably actually, and this is going to annoy me to say this, probably would be the Paranormal Activity films where like nothing happens.
The first 2/3 of the film, though.
Yeah, until they get to the end.
Until they get to the crazy end bits. But the first sort of half to 2/3, we're always like, yep, I've lived through this very situation.
And then it turns into a demon and we all sigh.
Yeah.
And I think this kind of brings us back to our blame. We always sound like we're blaming the paranormal TV shows, but it kind of brings us back to the paranormal TV shows and the way that they kind of ramp things up and the way that they have pushed aside stories and the folklore and very often the history of a place as well because it's almost not seen as being enough. It's not seen as being dramatic enough. And I wish we could get back to the stage where the history and the ghost stories, and I think also as well, the folklore needs to come back into it. I wish we could get back to a place where that is enough.
And I think, to be honest with you, particularly where the folklore is concerned, I do think that there is an appetite for that, because I think in some cases, like I must admit, I used to like watching The Haunted Collector.
Yeah.
The
It's
American
like
one.
Antiques Roadshow with ghosts.
Yeah. I've always said, imagine if they did a cross between Cash in the Attic and Haunted Collector. That would be amazing.
Oh, what I would watch.
But the thing I used to quite like about it was, even if like there wasn't a huge amount happening in the house and it wasn't like really over the top or whatever, they would find all this weird stuff in the history. And like the history part of it was almost, and I'm really nosy about stuff like that. So the researchers would come back with, oh my God, this happened and this happened and this happened. And I'm thinking, well, the history in and of itself, and indeed the local legends associated with those properties, was really interesting. So even if those people didn't have that stuff going on, just simply preserving the stories and, what had actually happened there was still really interesting. And that's one of the things I always quite liked about Most Haunted. Obviously, if you took a lot of the hysteria away, it was that sense of, I used to love it, when one of the particular mediums used to sort of come up with, oh, I'm getting the name so and such, and it would say at the bottom, like, there's no record of the person with that name in the property. That always used to make me giggle. But they were going to these amazing locations like Dover Castle. And I mean, they came to our castle when Yvette thought she was hearing like ghostly singing, and it wasn't. It was just people in the big market. And it was nice to kind of see these places that you wouldn't normally get inside, and to hear a bit of the history associated with them. And I thought, so really the folklore and the legends associated with these places in some ways is just as valid, if not more interesting, than the extra stuff that's then added on. And I think it's where it's really interesting when I look at some of the places that are supposed to be haunted, like in Newcastle. It's really quite tame stuff. Like, for example, there's supposed to be a monk that haunts the Tyneside Cinema, and he's supposed to really enjoy one of the particular screens. Now, that building stands on what used to be one of the many monasteries back in the day. And I love the idea that there's just a ghostly monk going, oh, what's on today? Oh, I hate the trailers. and he doesn't bother anyone. He doesn't bother anyone. He doesn't throw things around. He's just sometimes seen in the cinema. And I thought that's quite cool. I quite like that. And there's another one. There was a nun in horn-rimmed glasses. Used to appear upstairs in one of the shops, and she'd just smile at people and then vanish.
Oh, bless her.
I'm like, that's cool.
Oh, I love it.
And this is the thing that I get, like, even the idea of like Charles I popping in, sitting down and having a pint. And I just think, like, I've had weird experiences in that pub. And they're really, really tame and quite benign. But you go, yeah, that was a weird story that I've been able to bring home and tell someone, and then, connect with that person through the telling of the story. So I don't feel like you need to sort of add all the bells and whistles, unless the bells and whistles actually happen.
Experience.
Yeah, I love, I've said it before on this show, I love mundane ghosts. Like you say, ghosts that just appear and, they're sweeping or like doing the dusting or something like that. Making a cup of tea. We had one at the house, one of the houses I grew up in, one of my childhood homes. We had a ghost that we would just hear him clanking around you would hear the china, like making a cup of ghosty, and it was just lovely. So you just talked about a few different locations. The main thing that we do on the show is actually sort of, we go out and we do like a ghosty travel blog sort of thing. And we visit lots of different historical haunted locations. We haven't been that far up north, but if we were to go up to your area, if we get the opportunity at some point, what's one place that you would really recommend we had to visit?
I suppose you would have to go with the Castle Keep, because I mean it dates to 1167, so it's immediately got a lot of history going on. And I think the other advantage that you got, that we also have weird stories attached to it which have nothing to do with ghosts, like the legend of the flying donkey.
Wow.
Yeah, this is brilliant. This was like in the 19th century. The showman was like, "Oh, I'm gonna fly off the roof of the Castle Keep," and then he gets up to the roof and he's like, "Oh, this is a lot higher than I thought it was going to be." So he decides to test the wings that he was going to use by putting them on his donkey and more or less pushing his donkey off the side of the castle.
No.
Now, the donkey survived. The man he landed on didn't. I'm not sure. The way that one of the storytellers at Dave Silk actually tells at the castle. I'm not sure if it was attached to some kind of zip wire, so it was some kind of stunt that sort of went a bit wrong.
Oh.
But it's just the idea that like not many places can say they've got a legend of a flying donkey. So you've got weird stuff like that. But it was like, I mean, they used to brew beer in the chapel and all kinds of things. And it was obviously also the garrison for quite a long time. And it was used as a prison. So you've got all these things attached to it. And I would say just purely because of the age of the place, like some of the rooms have like a weird sort of atmosphere to them. And I think the other one that's supposed to be really haunted, but I've never actually done one of the investigations there, but the building does have a bit of a strange atmosphere, would be the Literary and Philosophical Society.
Okay.
Which is like the second largest private library outside of London. And Alexander Armstrong's actually like the chairman or something of it. And it's this beautiful old library that looks like something out of Ghostbusters. Like it's a fabulous
awesome.
space. But like if you're sitting in one of the rooms on your own, you feel like you are not on your own. It is really, really strange. And I'd love to do an investigation in there. I mean, they do their own investigations, but I've never actually done one. So I'd say the Lit and Phil would be cool. And there's bound to be others, but I can't think of them off the top of my head.
Well, those
they
two
will be
both
the main
sound awesome.
two.
Yeah, they do both sound like they are definitely going to make it onto the bucket list for places we absolutely need to visit as soon as we can. Well, we could keep speaking for hours because this is just so. Oh, Fitz has got one more question.
Thing I've
burning
got to ask.
Question by the look of it.
Well, basically, some of the best paranormal stories we get are from people that tell us, "Oh, I don't believe in ghosts or all that nonsense," but. And then they tell you this incredible story of something. He's like, and you don't believe after having experienced this? I'm wondering if you've ever encountered that sort of thing in folklore, like, oh, I don't believe in the pixies, but I will only step on this particular stone walking across this river because reasons. Like,
yeah, it's really common, and it's really funny because it'll be things like people will have like a weird superstition about particular numbers. And it's not even 13 a lot of the time. Like it'll be some random number that they've got their own personal reason why they've got to do something like a certain number of times. People still don't like breaking mirrors. I mean, they are a bit of a faff to clean up, and I mean, I've come across people who, they'll still be careful about like what plants they bring into the house. I've heard of people, like, for example, I've got a horseshoe over the back door, which was actually a souvenir from a holiday, but still. And I mean, personally, I went for a walk with a friend of mine up in Northumberland. Now, I believe in this stuff, so I'm slightly the wrong example, but I went for a walk with a friend of mine up in Rothley, and I mean, that's Faery Central. And I've got this pendant that a blacksmith friend of mine made for us. It's like an ammonite made out of steel. I'm like, well, I'm putting that on because I don't want to be stolen by the fairies. I've got stuff to do. And I'm going to hazard a guess they've not really got a particularly good 4G in Elfland. So I was like, I'll make sure that, nothing happens there. But, I mean, obviously, there are some people who, it tends to be more superstitions, I think, that people will follow. And there are a lot of things around, like, say, the number 13 still holds sway. Like, I mean, one of my students the other day got really like, oh, no, that's really bad luck. Because one of the deadlines for one of the modules is 13th of January. And I didn't cotton on that that's a Friday.
Oh, no.
So I said, well, just hand it in on the 12th then. And they were like, oh, yeah, I could, couldn't I? Like, yeah.
Bless
like,
them.
just because the deadline's this Friday doesn't mean you have to do it. But I have seen this where people will have like an item that they have to have with them for luck, and I think ultimately my general belief is that humans as a species do tend towards the fantastic and the magical, even if they don't want to. And I think people will have these little rituals and little practices that they do that, even if there's no scientific reason for doing it, just make them feel better. And ultimately, if a thing that you do makes you feel better, is there really any harm in it?
Oh, I can think of so many things that
I want to make that into a t-shirt now.
What's
Humans
that?
Tend towards the fantastic and the magical.
Oh, that's lovely. Oh, my goodness, that's lovely. We definitely need that. Like hawthorn I won't bring into the house.
Yeah.
If anybody listening is interested in the folklore of plants, Icy has done some amazing episodes on the Fabulous Folklore podcast about the folklore of plants, which I've been particularly enjoying because I'm a bit of a plant nerd. But yeah, hawthorn does not come in this house. Nope. As much as I love it.
It does stink, though, let's be fair.
Well, yeah. There probably was a practical reason behind that particular legend.
Yeah, but this is the thing, I mean, like, I just think that people have their own way of engaging with the world, and folklore is just quite a good way of everybody kind of engaging with things in the same way.
And I think that's a really good way of summing it up, actually, because my final question really was, for people who are interested in the paranormal but maybe have experienced that disconnect, maybe they've grown up more with books that are very drilled down to just ghosts, and they've seen TV shows that really kind of shove aside that folklore. What do you think? What would your advice to them be? Like, what would the study and the inclusion of folklore bring to that paranormal experience, in your opinion?
It widens the lens a little bit. So instead of looking at something from this really narrow view, because the thing is, there are so many ghosts in folklore that it's kind of broadening your perspective a little bit. And I think what most people would hopefully find useful is if you look at, obviously, a lot of the folklore podcasts will have an element of ghost stories and legends and so on, because of the fact that in some cases, I know the Lawmen did an episode about the folklore associated with like the missing head of Oliver Cromwell, but there are obviously some ghostly appearances that go along with that. So ghosts tend to make a little appearance in a lot of things. So it's quite easy to get your foothold in folklore because ghosts appear in it so regularly. But what I would also recommend is, obviously there's hundreds of podcasts to choose from, but one particular one, the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast, is really interesting, where people actually discuss their sightings of fairies. And when you actually listen to quite a lot of them, you're like, oh, that actually sounds really familiar. And you see how there's this huge crossover between sort of folklore and ghost stories. And I think obviously, like any of the folklore podcasts will include both. But I think if you've had that almost scientific paranormal investigation thing drilled into you, then I think the folklore sort of brings some of the irrational back to it, where it doesn't have to make sense and it doesn't have to necessarily feel realistic. And actually, the best crossover point I can think of is time slips.
Yes.
And I find these fascinating. And the number of people, because I did an episode about them, and obviously the jumping off point was the famous one in Versailles. And I must admit, I went to Versailles and nothing weird happened in the garden. I mean, it was 32 degrees, so I wasn't really thinking anyway. But I'm a northerner, we don't do 32 degrees.
No.
And but what was really interesting was the number of people who then said to us, either privately or like on social media, like, oh yeah, I had this weird experience. And it was essentially a time slip.
Yeah.
And because it's almost bringing ghosts of the past into the now, but you're going to them rather than them coming to you, sort of thing. They provide a nice little jumping off point that sort of explains some folklore, but also explains some ghost stories. So that would be the Venn diagram central part, I guess, would be something like that, where you can then look at actually what is it that these things tell us about the nature of reality.
I think that's just amazing. And I really think that there's actually a lot more crossover than perhaps some of us want to admit and would be comfortable admitting. But I also feel like those points where, like you say, with the Venn diagram, the crossover points, they're some of the most interesting.
Yeah.
So just to finish up then, for anybody interested, and I'm pretty sure everybody listening will be interested, where can people find your podcast, your blog, your books, all that good stuff?
Everything, like my blog and my books, are all on my website, which is icysedgwick.com. And that is Sedgwick, Sedgwick, because people will insist on putting an extra E in it.
Yep. I think I did.
It's really funny now, because if you actually put that into Google will go, did you mean? And it will correct people. And I'm like, thanks, Google,
that's
you've
sweet.
got my back.
Yeah.
But the podcast, I'm pretty sure, is like everywhere that you can get podcasts, like Spotify, Amazon, Apple, Stitcher, a whole load of other ones besides. And if you just search for Fabulous Folklore with Icy, then it comes up. It's on YouTube as well, but I haven't put all of the back episodes on there. So if you want to listen to them from the very beginning, then obviously one of the other platforms is better for that. And I'm on like all the social media platforms except TikTok, because I don't get TikTok.
No, I think we're too old for TikTok. We've had we don't get it.
We have
either.
an account. I haven't put anything on it yet because I haven't worked out what to put on it yet.
Well, I had issues with like security things around the app, so I was just like, I'll keep the username, but then I won't actually use it for anything. And I don't feel like I've necessarily suffered because of it.
We need a young intern to come and do that sort of stuff for us.
Explain the kids stuff down with somebody down with the kids, because we're not. Another good place to find you, of course, is under the hashtag Folklore Thursdays on Twitter and Instagram. Well, not just you, but many folklorists.
Yeah, and you'll find loads of ghost stories getting shared. There's also hashtags like of Dark and Macabre and Weird Wednesday and things like that, where people will share, and obviously weird spelled WYRD.
Mm-hmm.
People sort of share all kinds of strange little snippets of stuff. So it's quite a good, again, it's a good way to sort of dip your toe in the water, as it were.
And if you do go and look at Icy's website, there are actually some goodies on there as well. You can download a free ebook on using folklore methods to protect your home. And there is a free download of one of her novels, Skeleton in the Floor, which I'm reading at the moment. And it is very, very good. I am very much enjoying it.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
So thank you so much for joining us today, Icy. It's been really interesting. We really wanted to have these conversations around where the sort of folklore and the paranormal come together and cross over. And this was just such a fascinating discussion about that. So thank you so much for your time.
No problem.
Thank you so much to Icy for diving down that particular rabbit hole with us. We had such an amazing time chatting to her, and you can find all the links to Icy's work in the show notes, so please do pop over to her website and check out her awesome work. Just before we sign off for the day, we have a few more bits to share, as following on from the release of our special Halloween bonus episode on the infamous 90s BBC classic Ghostwatch, we were thrilled when some of you got in touch to share your recollections of the night it aired.
Alex said, "My first memory of Ghostwatch was sitting at my grandmother's house as a 10-year-old, seeing my father and grandmother falling asleep on the sofa with the TV on, just as Ghostwatch started. I thought it was interesting at the time, but don't really remember if I managed to watch the whole thing before my father woke up. I thought it was real, but I think I missed the end when everything kicked off. But when I rewatch now, it still makes me jump, even though I know it's fake and what's coming. I completely forgot all about the programme until I started dating my wife. When we were discussing paranormal shows and Ghostwatch came up, and that everyone believed it was really real when it came out. I guess as it's the 30th anniversary this year, it'd be rude not to watch again."
Simon said, "I watched it as a kid and it did frighten me. I can remember my parents laughing at me and telling me it wasn't real, but it seemed pretty real to me. I've seen bits of it since as an adult, and it's so obviously fake that I can't believe adults in the 90s fell for it."
Maggie said, "I remember seeing this and laughing at it. I never once thought it was real, even though I do believe in the paranormal. It shocked me when I found out that people thought it was a true documentary."
Ashley says, "I've purchased it several times on DVD over the years when telling people and they didn't believe me. As a kid, it freaked me out. I remember going into school the next day. Some kids had seen it and some hadn't. My mum didn't tell me it was fake for a good few days. I then remember a lot of people complaining, and I'm sure they had to announce it on TV that it was fake, but the latter might be the Mandela effect." No, you're absolutely right, Ashley. It Sarah Green was basically marched.
Yeah.
One of the presenters, Sarah Green, was a well-known children's TV presenter, and she was basically marched into what was called the broom cupboard where they presented from, to announce to the nation of children that shouldn't have been watching it but did, that it was fake, and she was absolutely okay and hadn't been whisked off to the cupboard under the stairs by the ghost. So not the Mandela effect on this occasion.
No. Tanya said, "I remember watching with my mum. I get my interest in the paranormal from her, and we used to sit up late watching scary films. It took a short while to realise that it was a mockumentary as opposed to a documentary, and was such an innovative idea for the time. I remember the Beeb received a huge backlash for trying to dupe people, as a lot of viewers had been truly terrified with unprecedented complaints received. Extra gravitas being given to the show due to the involvement of the incredibly well-respected Michael Parkinson. I bought a DVD of it a few years ago that I found at a £1 bargain basket somewhere, although I think it's worth so much more, as surely it gave inspiration to the real ghost hunting programs. I feel the need to dig it out now for entertainment purposes only."
John said, I've just finished watching my Ghostwatch DVD and I feel exactly how I did in '92 when I first saw it as a 13-year-old. Goosebumps all over me and feeling shaken up and scared. It's strange, even though obviously now I'm a lot wiser and know none of it was real, it still has the power to unnerve me.
And Bob said, I was a young adult with my new house when this was aired. It never stirred me personally, as the acting from the crew was a bit too cheesy and convenient. As you know from your own investigations, you could spend days at a location and not experience a thing. Ghosts on cue are a bit too most haunted for my liking.
Simon said, I watched Ghostwatch when it was released and as an 11-year-old got a hell of a fright despite my parents laughing and telling me it wasn't real. I don't think I managed to watch it all, but have in subsequent years.
Steph said, I saw Ghostwatch age 11 visiting friends in Carlisle. I mainly watched for Sarah Green. Had no idea it was a drama. The wailing cats were unforgettable. And when I was woken in the night by the friend's baby, I started screaming, the cats, the cats! Still amazing to this day.
Cats and Cucumbers said, I loved it, I saw it when it aired, and now watch every year with a mate. We chat via WhatsApp as he's far away. I only saw one pipe sighting when originally watched, and it still put the wind right up me. Fantastic piece of telly that still holds up multiple watches later. Class.
We also had a note from Paul, who said that it had a massive impact on me, and he provided a photo of a Pipes action figure that he'd helped put together.
I've seen this before on the Ghostwatch Twitter. It's amazing. I really want one of these action figures. If anybody knows how I can get hold of one, let me know.
Indeed. And I think there was an interesting mix there of people that were just like, yep, I thought it was fake from the off, and people that were just like, I thought it was real and I was absolutely terrified.
And looking back on it now, watching it as an adult, I kind of agree with all of them. It's a weird situation. It's a very odd, peculiar piece of television. And I think when we've watched it, we watch it every Halloween. And when we watch it, we kind of start, well, certainly I certainly start off thinking, gosh, this is so cheesy. I can't believe, that this fooled so many adults. I mean, we were children at the time, but I can't believe it fooled so many adults. It's so cheesy. The sound effects are bad. There's all these things that kind of point to it being fake. But every single year that we watch it over the course of the actual program, we get sucked in and it becomes really unnerving. We get absolutely drawn into the story. No matter how many times we've seen it and how cheesy it is, we get sucked in and get scared. And this year, because we did the interview with Stephen Volk and we did a special episode on Ghostwatch, we watched it multiple times, very close together. And I have to say, after watching it several times, almost in a row, and really diving into the folklore and looking into the characters and reading the script and doing all that kind of extra research, I was on edge. I was literally on edge for a while because of the cumulative effects that Ghostwatch had on me. So yeah, my advice would be enjoy it on Halloween. Don't watch it over and over again and read the script all in the space of like 48 hours.
No, I think it was perfectly summed up by @scrapbot13 on Twitter, who got back to us for simply /whimper.
I love that. So there we go. Still dividing opinion today. We loved hearing your recollections and experiences. And our 30th anniversary edition Blu-ray has now finally arrived in the post. So we're going to watch it again. Ill-advised or not, you be the judge.
And that, I'm afraid, brings us to the end of another episode of Not Once for Yes. Thank you so much for joining us, and please do get in touch if you've had a paranormal experience that you would like to share through our website at notonceforyes.com. A huge thank you to our patrons, KOFY and Repod supporters, without whom we wouldn't be able to do what we do. And Not Once for Yes is produced by my production company, Narrative Audio. So if you have a podcast and you'd like to outsource your editing and post-production, then please do get in touch either through Not Once for Yes or narrativeaudio.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode and that you'll join us again for some more spooky stories and haunted history on the next Not Once for Yes.
happy for